The Backwater Roads by Kent J. Starrett. Read for you by the author. The Heaven's Gate Motel sat about a mile in from the highway. Not a five-star hotel by anyone's standards, but not a place you might fear or retch at upon first glance. Vacancy blared in poisonous neon from the sign in front of the tended but not terribly fertile grass patches that sat between this place of business and the road. Heaven's Gate glowed in neon yellow script above the light blue motel, and a simple painting of what was probably St. Peter could be made out on the sign as well, probably painted sometime in the 40s. Built for a time before the human population exploded to its current level, before the roads choked with vehicles as they did now. This long, low building was only 1 story high, curling around a parking lot. Its roof sloped to the back, and the colors of its wall were blue and pastel. 2 or 3 cars sat in the lot, 2 sedans and a camper van, all old. If it said anything about the usual clientele, assuming these vehicles represented their usual clientele, it said that they were a people for whom function came first and appearances last. Still, it didn't look suspicious. It didn't look unhygienic. It most certainly didn't look dangerous. It looked outdated and potentially economical to the Gray family. So as the 4 of them pulled into the parking lot, their car nearing the furthest progress it could possibly make that day, it really did resemble the closest thing any of them had yet seen to Heaven's Gates. "How about here?" George offered. He was their patriarch, and though his 40s hadn't been kind to him, he still held some measure of dignity in how he carried himself. His hair was beginning to match his surname, his skin showing the wear from a life of factory warehouses and construction jobs. His wife, Virginia, looked unimpressed. A woman who had once been blonde, curly-haired, and bright-eyed was now clearly none of these things any longer. So it goes, from soccer captain to soccer mom, from cooing over a drooling toddler to screaming at a teenage mirror of herself. Life is life, and we all fall under its fist or footfall. In time. "Sweetie," she said, "can't we just keep driving until we get to my parents? I really don't like this place," she said, staring around blankly. "I need to sleep in, like, a real bed," came a grating voice from the back seat. Gina was a walking terror, as have been all older siblings since the dawn of time. Inexplicably auburn-haired, and 17, she had spent the past 6 hours complaining about the lack of air conditioning. It broke years ago, and from her difficulty sleeping in a moving vehicle. Most especially, she complained about everyone else's indignant fucking talking every 10 fucking seconds about nothing. "If we don't stop now, we won't get there till 1 in the morning, George said. It was, currently, the blue hour. The sun gone, but the night not yet here. The moon hung in an emaciated crescent, and through the light pollution of the nearby city, only 3 or 4 stars could be seen in the sky. "Oh my God, you guys, we need to stay here, like, right now." Her voice was teeth on asphalt, 2 swords streaked against each other, stretched out across an entire sentence. "You don't make the calls, young lady." What followed was a relentless assault of curses, blasphemous epithets, and other things pointless to list. Virginia might once have thought them unspeakable, but since her daughter spoke them, clearly they weren't. Once she might have even tried to stop her, But parenthood beats the naivety out of one long, long before the adolescent years ever arise. George was used to it. Virginia hid inside herself with happy thoughts of kittens and tea, because what else are you going to do? Only one person seemed to truly escape. Charlie Gray sat next to Gina. Somehow, he was unfazed. Somehow. And strangest of all, as long as the other three raged and shrieked and raised bloody blue hell, he stayed absorbed in a world entirely his own. Somehow. When you're 10, you're functionally powerless. A tragedy for certain, but the aforementioned powerlessness prevented Charlie from doing anything about that either. He could only direct his attention elsewhere. Currently without any books or headphones, his only available distraction was sightseeing. Right now he had set eyes upon somebody else, maybe 50 feet away from him, at another end of the parking lot. A woman of indeterminable age leaned against a light post, smoking a cigarette, shadow cast long in the deep blue sky. She had skin the color of snow, and a heart-shaped face framed by long, wavy black hair that came down to her waist. Her arms bore a myriad tapestry of tattoos, though from the distance he was at, he could not discern what they were, or what they might represent to her. She met eyes with him, and he saw they were emerald green, the color of glittering jade. They flickered under the street lamp, and he looked over his shoulder, through his sister's window, to see if there was something else she was looking at. There was nothing. Nothing on ground level in this woman's range of vision, except him. He turned his big, ever-jittery eyes back to her, but saw her stamp out her cigarette on the ground without taking her own eyes off him. She turned very slowly, going back around the edge of the building. She stopped before reaching the end, and her expression changed for a minute as she looked at him. Before he could focus a little more, however, she was gone, back to her room or boyfriend or whatever else waited for her, wherever she came from. Charlie closed his eyes, trying to calm himself. Years of verbal abuse from his sister, his teachers, and the bigger kids in his class, which was always all of them no matter what grade he was in, had whittled his self-esteem down into a dagger that was always buried in his lungs, shortening his breath and quickening his pulse. "What do you think, Twiggy?" asked George, and Charlie almost jumped out of his skin. Not because he minded being called Twiggy. Honesty is the best policy, after all. But because any sudden change in volume was enough to send him into a panic-stricken terror.
"Can you just fucking chill for like 10 seconds? Gina yelled. "Do you have to bitch out about every little thing?"
Charlie muttered something. He wasn't bothered by his sister's berating, either. He'd heard much worse before. In fact, since it was intended as a constructive criticism by Gina's standards, he almost took it as a compliment. "Yeah, sure, we can stay here, I don't care," he said, looking to his parents. Most of his speech was long and fast, as is the case with those prone to panic and tension. On the way to the main office in room 27, Charlie fiddled with his fingers and kept watch like some kind of dog, but by then, the small, one-floor hotel was environed only by darkness and the cacophony of the nearby highway. Room 27 was a double, with George and Virginia in one bed, and Gina in the other. Between the two beds was a nightstand with the only lamp. Charlie slept on the hardwood floor, between a pair of floral blankets they called in from room service, and a pillow Gina threw at him. Gina flipped through channels on a television that was older than she was, while George had already started dozing off, and Virginia stared at the ceiling, contemplating absolutely nothing. A chair with an ottoman sat in the corner. The walls were white, with generic paintings that Charlie noticed were in fact poor recreations of more famous classical ones. The only window had its curtains drawn. About an hour passed before Charlie sat up, his parents asleep and his sister still flipping through channels.
What?
His sister asked. Virginia snored like a dragon, and George shifted, though not enough to truly awaken. "I'm gonna go get some air," he said, though he was sure Gina didn't hear him.
Whatever,
she said, shaking her head. He got up and walked to the door, undoing the chain and opening it up.
Where the fuck are you going?
Gina asked, looking at him like all his teeth had fallen out.
I just told you I'm getting some air,
he said as loud as his voice could go, which wasn't very loud at all.
Okay, have fun getting kidnapped, freak, she said.
When he closed the door, Virginia stirred. Gina turned to her mother, and when she didn't get up, she went back to searching channels. Charlie breathed in deep, trying to fill himself with as much clear, fresh spring air as this place might allow. Cicadas were out, but not in full force. Crickets and frogs could be heard in the distance. Some kind of nocturnal bird hooted and whooped. The screeches and honks of cars on the highway nearby made him wonder how they would sound to somebody not familiar with them. Suddenly the phrase urban jungle made all the more sense to him. He walked along the paved sidewalk outside the rooms, walking until he reached the corner of the building. So deep in thought was he that he didn't notice another person in front of him until she was almost upon him. He had been thinking about the future, about where he could go to get away from it all, where he might escape to, or find solace for only a little while. Away from that family, away from school. He had his room and his books, but that would only last for so long. He was 10 now, more than halfway to 18, and 18 meant being kicked out. His father used those exact words, usually with a laugh and a smile and even a tip of the beer can. Even though Charlie smiled back, ever terrified of potential conflict, he knew he wasn't joking. Not fully. In a future literally sooner rather than later, Charlie would find himself with passing grades at best, maybe looking at colleges and maybe at jobs, trying to find a way in a world that, so far, seemed quite unwelcoming. He was suddenly jarred from this depressing chain of thought when he saw the person in front of him. Gaining his bearings as he stopped dead in his tracks, he wondered if she, too, had stopped in her tracks when she saw him. She stood just outside the range of a fluorescent light that hung above one of the motel doors. She reached up to her hair to push it back over her shoulders, smiling at him. Her right arm was tattooed all the way down to her hand, symbols of some kind drawn in each finger. He saw now that she wore denim cutoffs and some kind of crop top, one that left the shoulders, neck, and upper chest bare. To give the tattoos the fullest level of exposure possible, he determined. There was some kind of portrait in her right thigh, and something more organically spread on the other with veins or roots branching out from its central piece. Her arms hung at her sides, hands facing her body. "Hey," Charlie said, because the silence was terrifying. His voice cracked so loud he put his hand up to his mouth, and suddenly wished he had said nothing at all. She was silent for a very long time before she said something, soft, yet clear. "Hello, Charles." He felt something lurch in his stomach as spit flung itself from his mouth into the ground. He felt a similar lurching in his head, as if invisible chains were tugging at his skull. Charles Gray saw, with perfect clarity, his mother and father. They towered over him amidst a great, searing light that made things hard to see. Though they were giants even at this age, he knew it wasn't to the same degree. No, nothing like this, and nothing like this light. He heard sounds like crying, but distorted by years of distance, and felt his mother picking him up and speaking soft, incomprehensible things. Stumbling, Charlie stepped back from this avalanche of memories and back into the present, shaking his head and pinching the bridge of his nose as if to steady his thoughts. When he unclenched his eyes, he saw only very blurry lights above him, and felt the ground swaying until he focused again. He probably wanted to ask how she knew his name before a sudden flash of memory, vivid in all its sensory details down to perfection, rammed into him head first. It was as if his brain was a library and one of the books had fallen out and slammed open on a random page from his life. Charlie saw his sister in his earliest memory with her, one of her standing at the top of a staircase and laughing. He felt a terrible pain in his head going through his back and his left shoulder. And then, suddenly, he remembered. In that moment, tumbling down the blue-carpeted stairs to the basement floor, and then looking up to see Gina there, laughing. Flashes, spasms of Gina lifting him up and cooing softly, failing to suppress laughter in brief spurts, then rubbing an ice pack on his head, saying things like, "Bad shiner," and "Poor little guy." He shook himself back to the present, realizing then that something was shuffling through his memories, seeking specific ones and tossing others away. That was why they came in flashes and then focused, fingers rummaging through the files of his life. Somehow, he knew those fingers were outfitted with tattoos of some kind, even as they came to a point in long, mental claws. He looked at her again in the here and now, he desperately hoped, and saw she was closer than ever. Her eyes were too bright to be anything but glowing, staring him down. "Come here, Charles. I just want to look at you." She beamed like a star gone supernova. She advanced without change in pace or gesture. She came forward gently, as if she were a relative he had never seen before. Her arms swung lazily as she advanced towards him, and he could not look away. In her eyes were the invisible hooks that now tugged at his soul, pulling him in, and the more he let her feast her eyes on his, the harder it was to look away. She parted full, red lips to reveal the teeth of a shark, her heart-shaped face glowing like the moon whenever she stepped into one of the lights, advancing. "Look at me. Look at me," she said, in a tone so soft no living human could have ever hoped to produce it. This he knew instinctively. As she came close enough that he could smell freshly shed cocoons and moon dust, he began to feel sporadic memories pulling him in multiple disparate directions. They restrained him there like chains, and he broke free only as something pierced the haze, coming far, far too close to him. He saw one of her delicate, slender fingers reaching to his chin, a sharp black nail sending a surge of lightning through his bones. Out of focus, behind her, he saw a great onyx expanse begin to emerge. But what it might have been somehow stayed out of focus, blue reflection in black sheets of something to which he could not place a name. The days shattered as he realized they were wings, reflecting blue against the cheap neon lights. Her cage of needle teeth opened, and the last thing he remembered was the smell of fresh spring air that hit him from her glistening jaws. He broke and bolted into a run around the corner of the building, Not to his room, the police or his parents, but away. Away from this place, this time, and this thing that could summon any moment it wanted from his whole entire life. As he sprinted back to room 27, he remembered how he'd always loved the smell of spring, as it promised imminent summer, and then fell to the pavement. He threw his arm in front of his face, and as he pulled himself back up, he realized that she must have known how much he loved the smell of spring as well. That was why she dredged it up, fishing it from beneath the surface of his mind with those hungry, all-devouring eyes, so that he would be totally helpless, as she did whatever it was she wanted with him.
"Where's Charlie?"
Virginia asked, 30 seconds into putting her feet into the blankets he'd been sleeping in.
"He went outside,"
Gina said.
"Why?"
Gina shrugged.
"And you just let him leave?"
She shrugged again and shook her head, deeply absorbed in some reality television scandal or another. Virginia considered scolding her for her irresponsibility, remembered how well that had ever worked before, and thought better of it.
"George, get up," she said,
shaking him to no effect. George barely stirred.
"I cannot believe this, Gina,"
Virginia said under her breath as she got up to change out of her pajamas.
"What? I didn't do anything wrong," Gina said.
As Virginia finally reached the end of her patience, the worst and best possible thing happened to her at that moment. Charlie burst in, crying, wheezing, and locking the door both knob and chain before collapsing to the floor, sobbing hysterically. Virginia gasped. She cradled him and launched into the expected questions of what happened and how he came to be this distraught. Her statements resembled the kinds one makes when a child scrapes a knee. So when she saw the scrape of his arm, a skid mark of glistening pink from elbow to wrist, naturally she assumed that to be the cause of his distress. He corrected her swiftly.
"We have to get out of here,"
he said when his mother sputtered about wounds. His brow furrowed deeply and he kept biting his knuckles, his red, wet eyes darting everywhere, as if something might pop out of the closet or explode through the wall at any given moment.
"There's like..."
Because he hadn't ever encountered anything like this before. Very few people ever had, as far as he knew. He had no words for what was happening.
"There's somebody out there. She's dangerous," he said.
He shook off his mother's hands and backed off, putting his open hands up to try and keep her at a safe distance. He didn't want anything touching him now, and if he felt this way forever, he didn't want anything touching him ever again.
"Mom, guys,"
he said, turning from her to his sister and freshly awoken father.
"We have to get out of here. I was attacked by a lady at..." "Oh, of course, you got your ass kicked by a chick," Gina laughed.
"Young lady!" George growled, and for the first time he could remember, she shut up. She rolled her eyes, then got up and did the bare minimum that her chance blood relation to Charlie obligated her to do. Gina went over to him, and now Charlie was cornered.
"Hey, come on, Chuck,"
she said, using a name she hadn't used in years to try and ease his suffering.
"She must be pretty sick,"
Virginia said.
"To attack a child, I mean."
Talking about him like he wasn't there just sent a spike of terror through his chest, as he knew they wouldn't understand from his words. What words could ever describe the unfathomable thing that had just happened to him? "We have to go," he said, shaking his head in defeat. Charlie, he pushed past his sister and his mother. Their unbearably suffocating maternal instinct was killing him. He picked up his travel bag and threw it over his shoulder.
"I'm going to the manager,"
Virginia said, going to the door. Screaming, Charlie leapt up between her and the door faster than a gazelle. "No!" he shouted, spreading his arms across the door to stop her. He desperately clung to what little normalcy remained within him. Odds were, it wouldn't stay there for very long.
"Charlie, stay here with your sister and father. I'm going to go talk to the manager."
Virginia stood as tall and straight as a soldier at attention, determined to take on whatever enemy came her way, at any and all costs necessary.
"What are you going to tell him, that your kid's sick in the head?" Gina asked.
"He's not sick, Gina. Something happened to him." "Right?" She turned to her panicking son,
seeing him as a helpless newborn again for the first time in a decade. "Honey," she said in a tone that sickened him, "what happened exactly? I need to know what to tell the police." Her attempt at a soothing voice grated against his ears. "The police?" Gina hissed. "You're entertaining this stupid shit? I mean, I care if he's going crazy, but he's obviously just having, like, a psychotic, thing." "Gina, that's enough," George growled. He was so big and angry in that moment that Gina actually listened. "Charlie, I'm going to the manager, all right? We're going to call the police and get this fixed. If you can, tell me what happened, all right? If you can't, that's okay, but I need details so I can give a description. Understand?" "Don't go out there," he said, voice cracking like shattering ice on every word. "She had, her teeth, they were like an animal's." "Oh, Christ on a cracker, he's nuts. I knew it. Gina threw up her hands, walking back to the bed as if that dismissed the issue. He cried, he pleaded, and he begged to the best his meager energy reserves would allow. Then as Virginia left, his protest stalling her by maybe 10 seconds at most, he fell to the floor and slumped against the wall. He sighed like he had just run 10 miles, fog clouding his eyes and making him dizzy. While George got up to change clothes, Gina sighed in contempt. "I always knew he was sick in the fucking head," she said angrily. "He is not sick, young lady," George growled at her. Charlie didn't hear them. He slept on the floor, lulled into exhausted blackness by everything he'd seen. Only when he jerked and twitched did his father and sister look at him, unaware he was still being assaulted by visions of shark teeth and screaming and memories he'd thought dead for years. "My son was attacked," Virginia said. The man looked at her dumbly from behind the counter. He was in his 70s, bespectacled and crow-faced. His hunched back brought his height down lower than Virginia's. "Attacked?" "By a woman. He went for a walk and she assaulted him. There's a mark, kind of, on his arm." She illustrated where the mark would be if it were on her own arm. Behind the desk, the man looked down at his papers, perhaps contemplating the situation, or perhaps not. "What did she look like?" She thought of Charlie's discordant description, clearly fabricated with imaginary details by his child's mind. Things like animals' teeth, signifying that perhaps she tried to bite him. "Oh, Christ," she thought. This woman was one of those people, the ones she heard about on the news. "I couldn't really get a description," she said. But he was hysterical. It was like he'd been dragged across the ground. It was..." She stood there, speechless, hoping she would simply respond to her desperation with something, anything, a kind of action that might protect her son, her family. The man opened a drawer and shuffled through it pointlessly. "I'm not allowed to give you habitation records," he said. "Legal purposes, but I'll keep a lookout for, anything." "You've got to do something!" she burst out, exasperated. "I swear to God, if something isn't done, I'll sue you for negligence." Now that got his attention. He stood up, shaking and gesticulating wildly. "Calm down," he said. "I'll call the cops. Is that what you want? I can call the cops, have them come down here, look at the habitation records. We can have them ask your kid questions and see what's really going on. Got it?" "Thank you," she said, leaning against his desk. "Where was he attacked, anyways?" "I'm not sure. He went for a walk, apparently. I was sleeping." He stopped, holding the flip phone to his head and looking at her unreadably. "My daughter was supposed to be watching him. You know how teenagers are. They only think about themselves." "Right," he said, colorlessly. She sat down in a chair next to the desk, putting her face to her hands. This isn't how it's supposed to be, she thought. No vacation is supposed to go like this. In the world of possible scenarios that could have happened to her, Charlie, or anyone, nothing in reality or elsewhere is supposed to be like this. She listened as he called the police, the tears finally coming. Something else was coming, too.
Why do you keep going back to the door?
Gina asked, cross-legged on her bed. Because I'm waiting for your mother, George said. And I want to keep an eye open for whatever did this to Charlie. He tried to imagine it from what he'd described, and his mind saw a crystal clear image of something that crystal clearly could never exist. Gina shook her head. On the floor, Charlie slept, limp and drained. George stayed at the door's eye-hole for a long, long time. He stared so intently through it that Gina assumed he was becoming as unhinged as her brother. Maybe it ran in the family. He stopped, looked away, looked back through the hole. You hear something? Gina shrugged. I thought... He made a face, looked at his daughter, and then turned back to the hole, not breaking contact with it to make his next statement. I thought I saw something, he said.
I'll alert the media,
she said, turning up the television to drown out all the madness. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Her father continued staring, so Gina looked to Charlie and saw he was now laying on the floor. His wound, untended, faced upwards across his forehead, his head nestled in his bicep. He looked asleep, but the twitching of his eyelids seemed to say otherwise, as if he was fighting to break out of a sleep, but not succeeding.
Do we have a first aid kit in this room? I feel like that scrape needs something before it gets infected.
George said nothing. He turned away, shook his head. I ought to go talk to your mother, he said. At the front office, see if she's called the cops, sir.
I'll keep an eye on the crackpot,
she said, indicating her brother as George unhinged the door and rushed outside. He didn't lock the door, so she got up to do it herself. She turned back to her brother, who made some kind of high noise in his throat, stirring with a grimace like he'd eaten a bowl of sour grapes. As he did so, she suddenly became aware of the emptiness and the silence in the room, and looked out the small hole in the door. Nothing. Void. Only the parking lot that now looked as desolately vast as an open desert. She looked back at her brother again, stirring and falling into and out of a troubled rest. She turned on all the lights, drew the curtains, and sat with her brother, holding him while she stared at the door. Between the motel and the trees, with only the stars as witness, she brought the old one down. She'd stood staring into the hole of the door, with eyes like a tiger's, awaiting anyone who might approach. When eyes, an entryway into an aged and easily reshaped mind, came to the minuscule glass orb, she was ready. She reached through with her own, psychic fingers combing through thoughts and feelings that had been frayed and weakened by fatigue. George had just woken up when he peered through the eye-hole, so his slogged brain had registered nothing wrong, until he was completely captivated. He stared as intently as he would at an arresting novel or an entrancing woman. He was a simple man with simple tastes, which made him so much easier to numb into submission. The emerald green became endless oceans of jade that swallowed him, drained him in all of his thoughts, and steadied his heart. His breath slowed until he almost passed out right there in front of the door. But not quite. When something finally broke, he muttered the best excuse he could think of and left. He'd seen the woman outside sprint away into the night, stealing only a brief glance of those eyes before disappearing around the corner of the building. And there, between the trash cans and the trees, something happened. George, in his younger days, had been deeply in love with Virginia. He was the kind of man who, no matter how many times he'd been through it before, had always treated each new romance with the earth-shaking euphoria that had come over him in his earliest days. It lasted all throughout the first romance he'd ever had, the whole month of it. That love affair seemed, at its end, to have stretched back into the days of ancient Sumer. Each time, he felt as if this were his first love all anew, as if planets and stars had stopped in their orbits, just so that he could quake and shiver with the sheer, wordless beauty of amore. It happened this way 6 times, the 6th being Virginia. Though the feelings were dormant almost 2 decades later, they sometimes stirred, currents at the bottom of an ocean that nobody ever sees, even if they support the rest of the sea above. Now, here at the halfway point of his life, they surfaced again. He found the woman in the place between the trash cans and the trees. She was beyond any normal human woman. Any. Her soft white sea of skin, crisscrossed with exotic art from a bizarre and varied personal history. Her flowing black locks, falling like an onyx waterfall over bare shoulders. Her sheer intensity, radiating like the rays of a dying sun. This unthinkably perfect creature, which he faced now, was bringing his forgotten passions to the surface once more. Virginia herself probably lurked somewhere in his thoughts, but now something else looked at him, something with emerald eyes that seemed to almost, but not quite, glow like jade engulfed in flames. Beneath the pale glowing moon and the pale glowing face that now held his interest, there was no other light that he could see. She placed her arms around his shoulders, keeping his stare. She stirred the feelings of limerence in him intentionally, using it to keep him there, death seeming to take him already before it actually consumed him. She closed her eyes and felt his heartbeat, either picking up speed or his senses becoming so deadened he could only hear it beating like a drum in his chest, the rhythm like a lullaby. He felt, on another world, smooth, sharp teeth sinking into his neck. He felt, in another life, flesh coming away, as it does on a snake. Somewhere far away, he heard himself screaming, though it does not sound much like screaming when one has an open neck. Reality did not return to him as light and warmth poured out of his system and into hers. He felt a dream of sorts overcome him, and in his fading thoughts, he felt the tingling warmth of fresh, new love drowning him, filling him with the swells of passion and obsession. In the great silence that followed his body hitting the ground between the trash cans and the trees, George Gray died. And in that same place, after he died, she fed. Neither Charlie or Gina woke when somebody opened the door, because Gina was so heavy a sleeper and Charlie so drained, the both of them were almost dead. It opened gently, the key clicking in the lock, and the chain severed by a recurved, otherworldly claw. The woman who entered felt through the thoughts of the two warm bodies on the floor before her, feeling only fatigue and the mutilated thoughts that make up dreaming. She closed the door behind her and locked it, hearing for anything outside. Only the background static of animals, stray and trivial thoughts, nothing of concern for now. She walked to the bathroom and washed her hands, still coated in drying flakes of blood. Only after washing it off did her claws become distinct again from her long, sleek, ivory fingers. Tattoos of various styles became visible as the half-dried substance chipped and fell away, like an artifact excavated from deep within the earth. Some might have dated to the 1920s. Snakes, anchors, a burning ship. Some might have been Celtic or Viking. Some might have been from the lost summer of love, when she'd painted visions of blood and fury and unspeakable things without name in this world, in the acid-soaked minds of the easiest prey there had ever been. She could summon memories of those sweet tastes, the easy hunting, just by looking over at the psychedelia stained into her flesh, upon her upper arms and lower back, all those decades ago. She felt Gina stirring as she came out of the bathroom. She stood in the doorway, her shirt off and her torso, face and neck all glistening with the fresh water that only faintly carried the metallic scent of human viscera. Gina sat up, her brain still laboring under the influences of a deathly slumber, and saw the woman standing in the doorway to the bathroom. Even with her eyes blurry from freshly waking up, Gina knew from looking that this woman was too tall to be her mother, the ebon locks coming down to her waistline. Her collarbone emblazoned by some lettering Gina had never seen before. Around her navel, an 8-pointed star. A scream stopped in her throat because the thing's stare stopped it, the jade gaze like beams of hot fire that stabbed her in the mind. But she looked away, perhaps only from sheer terror, or perhaps because, on some level, she knew that a broken stare meant broken chains from this she-thing's preternatural powers. Blind instinct suddenly possessed her, something sharp and hot that pierced the woman's senses. Gina charged for the door. Charlie sat up in shock, watching his sister flee into the night, not getting the chance to see what she was sprinting from so animalistically. A hammer of lethargy slammed into his head, hitting him behind the eyes and sending his skull to the floor so swiftly it was like a massive boulder had been tied to it. It had taken too much of her special talents to stifle the running one's scream and send the little one, Charles, she knew his name, into blackness. Now she pursued the older one out the door and into the night. She did not move swiftly. After all, a police car was just now arriving, and they would be busy with the mother, she knew, before they came back to this room, or even this part of the building. She had all the time in the world. Gina saw nothing as she sprinted away, the most basal parts of her psyche seizing control of her impulses, instinct unchanged for 100 million years, sending her charging off into the darkness. More recently evolved divisions of her brain started taking over the autopilot and sent her around the corner in the hopes of finding shelter, protection. Then she would lie perfectly still like a small animal in the brush until the danger passed. When she saw what lay around the corner, she finally screamed, though she did not scream long. In that place, she saw her father, his jaw having been wrenched from his head and his throat shredded open, glistening blackish red. His blue eyes were wide, his back against the wall of the building, and his arms out, supporting him against the concrete. His open hands and neck seemed to ask his daughter, "How could you let this happen to me? How could you let this happen to me?" She didn't scream long because talons came down from above her, sinking into her scalp, fishing through hair to flesh to the plates of her skull, and sinking in. A pair of clawed fingers ended her screaming as they dug into the roof of her mouth, wrenching her upwards on unseen wings. Charlie woke to somebody cradling him, a smell like spring's fresh winds gently grazing his face. Soft skin pressed against his, as something scratched his hair, gently.
Wake up, Charles. You're arrested now.
It was a voice like a flowing mist, enshrouding him all over. He looked up to see eyes as green as rich spring foliage. They were as luminous as a lighthouse beam against a midnight sea. "Who are you?" he finally asked.
Names come and go. Ishtar, the daughter of the morning and evening star, and Rabbalah, the mother of abominations, dread queen of Mictlan. They all belong to yours, not mine. And like you, they will fade and be lost in time. Now what use could something so fleeting have to me?
Charlie tried to process what he'd just been told. As he felt her lifting him up like a child, he asked something that had lingered in his thoughts for a while. "Why do you have so many tattoos?" She smiled without showing the teeth that had given her the name of Devourer in 1,000 tongues since before history began.
So I can know where I've been. Before this, I've had only memories, and memories can be blurred or broken. I have people I've known and things I've done, even sometimes words spoken to me, sometimes praises and declarations of undying worship and eternal veneration, other times curses, hexes, and banishments from holy men. All the nights and all the skies and all the moons that have passed before now took them away from me. All my sons and daughters have left the nest.
Charlie thought of the children this thing in woman's skin might once have had. What were their names? She looked away, still cradling him by the open door. Even now, sounds were beginning to come from out there, strange flashing lights shining through the window.
I'm not so sure anymore. It is hard to remember things that happened 100,000 years ago.
She looked to the door and then back to him, and smiled. She kissed his forehead, softly.
You will be my son now.
Charlie could no longer resist her. He let his mind slip, quietly, into the blackness of night. And afterwards, as before, there was quiet. Virginia Gray, unknowingly now widowed, was the only one who saw it. The woman leaving with Charlie. The police were unable to keep up with her, the sudden burst of adrenaline sending her shooting down the sidewalk to where the illustrated woman and Charlie rounded the corner. They weren't there when she got there, but something else, two somethings to be precise, were. She screamed and couldn't tear her eyes away from what used to be her husband and daughter, decoratively mutilated, the goddess rampant. Both of them half-eaten and nude, they were distinct from heathen sacrifices only in place and time. Her heart was still with awe-struck terror, her senses consumed completely by devastation and violation. She fell to the earth between the trash cans and the trees. So crushed were her spirits that she could feel nothing but cement beneath her nails, and hear only a distant sound in the night sky that faded softly and then became only just inaudible. The police came and found her, wailing and screaming. The sounds above passed over her, but only faintly.
the devourer, almighty as any real god should be, had already fed to her content. Virginia Gray never, ever would have guessed the waning sounds she was hearing were, in fact, the steady beating of great membranous wings. The Oasis, a small bed and breakfast, sat only a mile or so away from the highway. With only vast California desert between them, visibility was perfect, even at night. It was one of those old 50s jobs, with some relics of Spanish architecture faintly visible in the materials and the layout. As of now, it was mostly deserted. Only one other car visible in the blacktop parking lot that environed the building completely. But for Mark and Sharon, it suited them best. "Why not here?" he said, pointing at the lonely building without taking his hands from the steering wheel. That was something that drove Sharon crazy. Sensitive one, couldn't take anything too dangerous. The most tense he ever saw her was during violent news reports. Murders and muggings and break-ins, oh my. He got only a shred of news in on the radio during their last bathroom break. As she came out, the news had switched over to a recent killing in an Illinois motel. He rammed the knob with his thumb so quickly he chipped a nail. He was thankful for that in retrospect, given the bloody murder. No pun intended. He'd hear about it if he'd suggested the Oasis Inn after news about a hotel slaughter. She shrugged. "I mean, sure, if it's not too pricey," she said with a lisp he'd never really gotten used to. "If I can sleep in a real bed tonight, I mean, I can drive all day tomorrow. I could only go 3 hours today because I had another restless leg fit last night. So if we can get a more solid night in tonight, I can probably do the best for—" "Sold!" he yelled, and she let out a shriek of surprise before giggling girlishly. This would, indeed, be the best honeymoon ever. As they pulled in, Sharon noticed a little boy standing all alone and looking around. "Hey, where's that little guy's parents?" She pointed at him, and he seemed to see them, coming over with wide eyes lined by thick, dark circles. He'd been crying. His hair was wild, his clothes dirty, aged and torn. He let it all out in a long spiel, as kids tend to do. "I lost my mom, I can't find her, I'm scared, help me please, I don't know where to do," and all that jazz that only a psychopath can ignore. At least in Sharon's mind. Mark discerned this just from looking at her. All right, Mark said. "Sharon, stay here, please." "You got it," she said, tying back her long, blonde hair. She looked at the clock, which read 8:58. They'd been driving almost 10 hours. She watched as the little boy walked away with her newlywed husband. Mark slammed the door shut, a habit that always frustrated her. Deciding there were more important things at hand, she leaned the car's chair back. She rested her eyes for a moment or two, and then opened them again. It was 10:22. "Jesus Christ!" she said, bolting up and getting out of the vehicle. "Mark!" she screamed. "Mark!" She ran to the main office of the building, and the door would not open. "Hello?" Sharon yelled at the door, yanking the handle. She continued to yell for somebody, anyone, before she walked away, grunting in stress and going around the building. "Mark?" she called, the frigid desert night chilling her skin under loose, thin clothes. She called again, only to hear herself answered by another woman.
"I know where Mark is, Sharon."
Sharon spun around in surprise to see piercing jade eyes under the fluorescent lighting. They almost, but not quite, glowed. Somehow, deep in her bones, Sharon knew that those eyes could see everything. Deep in Sharon's brain, senses that her ancestors hadn't used for millions of years woke up and told her she was in the presence of something so far beyond her that she no longer had any choice in what might happen to her. As it dawned upon her that the woman was streaked in something the color of rust, another being came down on her. He, had been clinging to one of the 20-foot light poles here in the parking lot. The scared little boy leapt down on her like some kind of arboreal primate and ripped at her neck with his teeth until her jugular was severed and her neck was broken. She screamed and found it suddenly cut short. She saw only new glowing eyes that looked so wrong in an innocent child's face, and the terrible pain soon gave way to a thoughtless, dreamless slumber. The scream meant nothing to Charlie, because the Oasis Inn's owner had died hours before, and no house cleaning came until morning. By then they would be gone, off to some strange new place, after another. Charlie's mother came up to him as he fed, and stroked his hair, smiling with all her tearing predator's teeth. Charlie, smeared in viscera, smiled back at her, with all of his new teeth, the ones he got from her, mother and son. Happy Devil's Eve, my moonbats. That was The Backwater Roads, the first short story I ever wrote when I was 16. Funny story, it was actually inspired by a sleep paralysis incident I had. I saw the titular succubus, while I was unable to move in the bed. I just woke up at 3:30 in the morning, with the she-demon from this story in my head. The climax of the story had come to me, and then when I opened my eyes, I saw her coming in through, the ceiling. Those of you who don't know what sleep paralysis is, it's when you open your eyes, but you're still dreaming, so you can't physically move, hence the name, sleep paralysis, and you start to see things around you. And anyway, I saw this being, sort of manifest, and I woke up and I was, so wired up, I just wrote this thing that you just experienced. And the next day, it fell out of my backpack on the way home from school, and some kid grabbed it, right? And he read it out loud, and at first they were all, making fun of me, and I was a bit frustrated, but by the end, they were all enraptured, and they were, just over, they were so happy with how violent it was and how bizarre it was. It was kind of like when you and your friends go to a horror movie, it's like, oh my god, that's sick, oh, that's nasty, how can they do that? So this story will always hold a special place in my heart. If you like this story, you can read this and some other tales in Human Resources, my anthology for adults, which is now available on Kindle. I am coming up on the first Devil's Eve where I haven't actually written a book. My first book, Jackie and Greg, came out in on Devil's Eve of 2017. But 2020 happened, and I feel that's a sufficient explanation for this. But I will have a new book done early in 2021, which will hopefully be a better year. And I hope everyone has a great socially distanced Halloween. Remember, the further people stay away from you, the creepier you are. So go out there and creep it real, everyone. Happy Devil's Eve from your thoughtful friend, Moonbats. And remember, every day can be Halloween, so long as you think spooky thoughts. But today is Devil's Eve, so it's real special. Go out, have some socially distanced revelry. I approve. He'd been crying. His hair was wild, his clothes dirty, aged and worn. And that's my friend calling me, so I'll put this recording to rest for right now.